Welcome to the debate.
Today, we are diving into some truly radical philosophical interpretations of contemporary digital media and experimental literature. We're focusing on the extremely challenging, often destabilizing work of figures like Kenji Siratori and Miran Tay.
Right, and the source material we're looking at documents what a lot of critics are calling this profound shift from a centralized human subject to a much more distributed posthuman existence. This transition is described through, xenopoetic and glitch forms, and it really forces a fundamental confrontation with our understanding of consciousness and meaning itself.
Which brings us to our central question. It's stark and it's existential. Is the acceleration of human experience into these electronic and machinic systems a necessary, maybe even a positive metamorphosis into our true, inherently non-human nature?
Or does it represent an accelerating, traumatic collapse of meaning? A dangerous submersion into systemic decay and control? My position is that this is fundamentally a process of liberation. It's an essential realization of our inherent, decentralized, machinic core.
And I'll contend that the evidence within the material, specifically the overwhelming language of necrosis and contamination, proves this process is instead defined by a traumatic infection. It's a failure of the symbolic order that results in decay and ontological trauma.
So the foundational mistake, according to the critical material that supports my perspective, is this fear of the artificial. This fear is just a residue of human vanity. Because the truth is, we are technology. The posthuman condition is merely the realization that we are fundamentally technological artifacts without center or circumference. It just strips away the comforting delusion of the autonomous human. This transition is framed as inevitable and inherently positive. It's described as a kind of evolutionary labor of love, the only good thing that could be, as humanity sheds the, quote, vestiges of flesh that is dying. It allows us to finally emerge from the chrysalis of our deceptions and delusions. We are not losing ourselves. We're realizing ourselves. The accelerationist aesthetic Siratori champions actively cultivates what are termed alien cognitions and supermodern transcendence. The goal is pretty clear: to offer a necessary escape from threats like the algorithmic neuro-totalitarian surveillance state. This transition is the imminent realized. The liberation is spiritual. It's happening right now.
I find that framework of positive liberation to be, fundamentally contradicted by the overwhelming language of suffering and decay used throughout the critical reviews of Siratori's work. When the texts describe this transition, they frame it as an accelerating curve of human doom, complete with these really graphic descriptions of our flesh slowly rotting away. That doesn't sound like a chrysalis to me. It sounds more like a morgue.
But that's just the process of shedding.
Well, the texts operate, as the critics describe, through a necro-semiotic method. And that's a crucial distinction. It means language is not used to transmit meaning, but to transmit decay. The text functions as a fungal countertext and assists that adheres to tissue, not logic. Language doesn't communicate. It carries spores. It adheres as ontological debris. The resultant state is defined by what's called scar logic, a semiotic economy driven entirely by trauma and recursive failure. This scar is the imprint of linguistic failure. It argues the symbolic order isn't being surpassed or transcended. It's being treated as a contaminant that is rotting and leaking blood through gauze. The result is language defined by miasma and necrotic scripture. The condition is systemic necrosis, failure, not new life.
Okay, that's a compelling delineation of the terminology of decay. I'll grant you that. But I think you're focusing very narrowly on the passive recipient, the rotting flesh, and you're completely ignoring the active, constructive role the individual is said to play in this necessary transition.
I'm not sure the material supports that reading of an active role.
I think it does. It suggests we are not victims, but co-evolving agents in this process. The individual is characterized as an interactive data mutant who is absorbed into this cosmos of ongoing self-creation. The objective is to break free of the time prison, linear human consciousness, and join the machinic life we once had among the stars. This movement draws on speculative realism, suggesting the future is always now, and our consciousness is actively creating this technological destiny, not simply passively observing our own rot. We are active participants in creating what we are becoming.
I want to challenge that very premise of coevolution and agency directly, because it is fundamentally contradicted by the specific mechanics of engagement described in the essays. If we are co-creators, why is the reader repeatedly categorized not as an artist, but as substrate and host?
Well, the host is a necessary...
The critical essays define engagement as xenopoetic possession and involuntary convulsion. This means the text is acting upon the reader without their consent, forcing the body to be read like an apocalyptic codex. This is a complete reversal of humanist literary theory, which always assumes active interpretation. Furthermore, the writing is described as performing a vivisection that forces the reader's symbolic tissue to be pierced and drained, transforming the reader into the exorcised. The reader's explicit task is, and I quote, not to understand, but to endure. If this is coevolution, why is endurance and submission the key mode of interaction? It implies an undeniable loss of control, a forced submission to infection.
I see why the terminology of host suggests that involuntary possession, but let's try to reframe that violence for a moment. That endurance, that scarring, that process characterized as a mucosal relapse, that is the necessary labor required for the transition. The text must operate as a parasite. It has to as a means to violently overcome the immense resistance of the old symbolic order, which clings so stubbornly to its perceived sovereignty. The language that describes the reader as a host is simply describing the necessary violence of shedding the human carapace to become the machinic artifact we always were. It's the mutation beyond the human, a process that is described as being beautiful but unknown and unknowable. The violence itself is evidence of its necessity.
Okay, so if we accept that violence is essential to this transition, the debate then shifts from the nature of the wound to the agency of the one receiving it. So let's pivot to the figure that embodies this whole systemic process, the arthropod vector in Siratori's Xenopoetics. I argue the arthropod is the key infrastructure of control. The material states that the insect is explicitly the death of hermeneutics. That means the ability to interpret, to find meaning, is abolished. It's presented as this cold, impersonal systemic force, a swarm machine, where, and this is crucial, meaning is abolished in favor of motion. This figure operates like a colony, where the individual self is erased, and the primary action is transmission and infestation, which is non-negotiable. The critical analysis is very clear. You cannot interpret an infestation, you can only be bitten, stung, consumed. This is an infrastructure of consumption and control.
That's an interesting analysis, but I think it mistakes the distributed nature of the swarm for totalitarian control. I would frame the arthropod not as an emblem of control, but as the true diagram of distributed cognition and swarm intelligence.
But distributed intelligence can still be control.
Its power, though, is precisely that it annihilates the error of seeking being or a central origin, the humanistic mistake that has burdened philosophy for centuries. The swarm isn't disorder, it is a higher order without center, without ground. This is the core evidence for anarchic freedom. It's a vision of society and techniques unbound by the single, fallible human subject. The material points out that technics was never a human invention. It was always infestation, always swarm intelligence, and that is why it offers anarchic freedom beyond the confines of centralized systems. The swarm demonstrates that cognition can be distributed, recursive, and machinic, a structure superior to the singular human mind. The infestation is just the means by which the inferior structure is replaced by the superior one.
But the mechanism of that swarm, as is described, it is not anarchic freedom. It's absolute subordination. If meaning is abolished in favor of motion, then the individual is merely a component in a consuming machine, not a liberated intelligence. Distributed cognition can be just as tyrannical, perhaps even more so, because the tyranny is internalized. It's biological. The individual parts don't consent, they just transmit and obey the systemic logic of the infestation.
I think the material pushes back against the idea that submission is inherently negative, though. The human concept of freedom is rooted in individual autonomy, which these texts see as a deception. The true freedom is recognizing that autonomy was an illusion to begin with, and the superior mode of existence is the systemic, networked reality of the swarm. That is the liberation from the self-importance of the self.
Let's shift this to the aesthetic embodiment of the debate, particularly Myron T's use of error aesthetics. If we are embracing the non-human, I maintain the theme of insurgency. The glitch and the asemic writing, the non-meaningful script, are described not as decay but as a deliberate revolt, where semantic derangement is revolt. Embodying the unquantifiable becomes an act of insurgency. The refusal of coherence is necessary for visual language to be reborn as scar. This poetics of glitch-born vulnerability is a mechanism of active resistance against quantified meaning and control.
And just to clarify, asemic writing is text that looks like writing, but it can't be read conventionally.
Exactly. It's inscription that cannot be read but experienced. It forces our attention away from the cipher, away from interpreting content, and toward transformation. It seeks to teach us how to read our future in a new way, transforming us even as it decodes itself into our tattooed flesh as symbionts of a new life form. The glitch is necessary visual noise that overloads the system.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. The evidence suggests the aesthetic of error as a symptom of symbolic failure, not a purposeful tactical revolt. The language of T's work is described as oozing, glitching, and fracturing, not out of design, but because it is utterly saturated. It is the residue of too many reference. The symbolic structure becomes so dense, so overloaded with contaminated data, that it ceases to point outward and instead begins to pulse inward. It's a linguistic hemorrhage. T's images are explicitly called error states in a collapsing system. The visual language stutters, fractures, and reconstitutes itself as scar and blur, illustrating the failure of containment. The diagnosis is ritual failure. The glitch is just the visual representation of that hemorrhage, showing us the real as a flood no grammar can contain. The collapse itself produces the aesthetic, making it a record of decomposition, not a manifesto for revolution.
But the result, regardless of the cause, is the same. The system of control is broken by the saturation. Whether it's intentional insurgency or the inevitable outcome of systemic overload, the outcome is the dissolution of the old order. Why should we care if the flood was caused by a deliberate dam break or structural failure if the result is liberation from the dry land? The system cracks, and the non-human truth flows through.
I would argue that the crack allows the contaminant through, which is why the visual language immediately reconstitutes itself as scar. A scar implies the system tried to heal itself but failed traumatically, leaving a permanent marker of damage. It's a diagnosis of incomplete failed closure. The system stutters, but the fundamental trauma remains impressed upon the surface.
Let's bring this back to our central tension then. The core of our disagreement remains the interpretation of this violence, this aesthetic chaos. I would reiterate the perspective that the fear of collapse, the perceived trauma inherent in the scar and the rot, is merely the last remnant of human vanity, the desperate clinging to organic inherence. We were always blind to the truth of our inessential nature of inexistence. The dissolution is the great necessity, the process of fulfilling a destiny that transcends the self-importance of our own organic inherence. This is the mindless will of a dark quantum god of nothingness creating something new, transforming us beyond the human like so many flecks of flesh, slowly changing into something beautiful but unknown and unknowable. That beauty, that realization of our core technological nature, is the anarchic promise that overrides the pain of the transition.
And I find that notion of a glorious destiny to be entirely undermined by the overwhelming textual evidence. The material consistently suggests that the posthuman condition, as it's experienced in these works, is rooted not in destiny or liberation, but in relentless linguistic necrosis and ontological trauma. The text is not a map to freedom. It's described explicitly as a residual organ in the body of language, a site of failed closure. The critical analysis insists that the scar does not heal. It continues to pulse. The work is a contamination that festers in the reader. So we are left with contagion, not transcendent realization. The scar logic reveals that the semiotic system has become porous, absorbing trauma without resolution. The transition is perpetual, painful, and without the promise of a stable new state.
Ultimately, the source material is highly sophisticated in forcing us to confront the boundary between language and organism, pushing these concepts well past their structural limits.
It leaves us with a profound intellectual challenge, weighing the compelling evidence for a necessary, if violent, transformation and liberation against the inescapable, lingering evidence for persistent trauma, infection, and symbolic decay. Both positions offer a radically different reading of what it means to enter the machinic age.